I also am humbled to be here, especially as an outsider to your community. I'm aware of that, and I'm going to do my best not to put my foot in my mouth and offend. But I also realize that I can't be afraid when I talk tonight, because if I am, I'm not going to be able to tell you the truth. So I'm going to do my best to take from my experience and observations with the thousands of families that I've worked with and share some of those lessons with you and bring them back to you. My mother-in-law, one time, she's a school teacher and she's retired, and we were talking about my book and about the work that I do with children. And she was saying it would be great if you could go to schools and teach teach teachers how to talk to their children. That would be a great thing to be able to facilitate that. And my response was, if you learn to listen, the children will tell you all that you need to know. And so while my talk is about talking about how to talk to your children about drugs, really what I'm going to talk tonight about is about listening. My work is to give you new ears, to give you new eyes, so that you can then be present with your children. And I want to make this very clear to you. Treating drug-addicted families and prevention work is almost the same thing in a lot of ways. I was hired by somebody one time that they brought me on board and saying, we want you to work with our son and our families to make sure that he doesn't need to go to your program. He's been in the program for a while now. And but the thing that I noticed right away, I said it's the same work. You're going to have to do the same work. You're going to have to talk about feelings. You're going to have to talk about what's going on. You're going to have to talk about things that are frightening, things that you're uncomfortable with, and you're going to have to learn how to listen. And so the work is the same, whether you're treating an addict or you're treating somebody preventatively. A lot of my clients and students, we call them students when they're adolescents, and young adults, we call them clients. They say to me, well, I don't have a problem. I said, fantastic. Because what we're going to give you is going to give you tools and skills and insights and a spiritual awareness so that it's not going to become a problem. It's less likely to become a problem. And if it does become a problem, then you're going to know what to do with it. It's already been talked about tonight, but I think shame is a huge barrier. The actor and comedian Robin Williams, who I admired and loved his work, he died in 2014. And he was well known in the addiction community as somebody who was in recovery. He was also somebody who had suffered from mood disorders. And I remember after he took his own life in August of 2014, I was to go on a radio show and talk about it. And so I was talking to a lot of my colleagues, and it was out there amongst my colleagues, and we were talking about what killed him. Was it the depression? Was it the mental illness? Was it the addiction that killed him? And one of my colleagues, I think, said it best. He said, shame killed him. So you can get treatment for mental health. You can get treatment for depression. There's medication and therapy for that. There's family work, family support, there's support groups. You can get treatment for addiction. Shame is what's going to kill you because it's going to prevent you from going to those places. It's going to prevent you from talking about something like this in your community. It's something that's going to get in the way. It's going to be the roadblock. I talk about it in my community using the story of Adam and Eve. And forgive my clumsiness in this group to talk about this. But I talk about it, this idea that the most insidious sin that was committed in that early story was when they were told that they were naked and that they should be covered up, that they should hide from God. That was the sin, right? That was this thing that I am, this human that I am, is unacceptable. And so my solution is, the lie that I believed in that story is that I need to hide myself and cover myself up. And that's the thing that's going to be the most deadly. That's the barrier that's going to get in the way of anybody getting the help that they need. And that's why I admire so much. I was so happy to come here tonight to talk to this group, because I think that it's an example of a courage, and it's an example of the beginning of a dialogue, like Lewis said, of something that is going to hopefully continue to burn with all of you and continue to grow in this community. You know, it's here. And denial's a part of that shame. It's motivated by shame. It'll kill you too. Abraham Tversky wrote a book called Addictive Thinking. And he said something I think that was really interesting in it. He talks to families, because one of the things that I've been told as I've been preparing for this and talking to rabbis is make sure everybody knows this is a family issue. You know, the idea that you send your kid to therapy, we get that. You send your kid to therapy. When he's fixed, will you send him back? That would be really convenient for me. We call it Trojan horse therapy in our program, because we accept that as the request, and then we get out and surround the family and start providing support, which is just therapy and help for the entire family, because this is a family disease. But Tversky talks about this idea that when he encourages family members of addicts and alcoholics to get into their own treatment, they have the exact same excuses as the alcoholics and addicts themselves. It doesn't apply to me. I can do it on my own. These are not my people. I'm uncomfortable. I don't need it. All the same excuses that prevent family members, parents, and relatives from getting into the work are the same exact excuses that their children are using, or the addict, if it's not a child, is using that they justify, they tell themselves to get them out of the work. Like I said, the most important thing that you can do is listen in the process. And really what I talk about is a change in sensibility. There has to be a new way of thinking about all of this to really make a difference. And we do know that tools and skills can change you. George Orwell said, the great writer said, if thoughts can corrupt language, then language can corrupt thought. And what he was speaking about is sometimes what you say, sometimes what you read, sometimes what you write, sometimes what you're surrounded by, the dialogue you're surrounded by, can change you in the process. So I do want to talk about some tools and skills with you tonight that are accessible. They're also printed in the handout that you have so that you can walk away with some tools, because to grasp all of this insight is a life's journey. But to begin to practice some tools can begin to change you. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was listening. That idea that, the lectures, and I'm good at them, I do them for a living, that's not the most important thing. I call it, actually, if you're going to give a lecture, I call it the grocery store lecture, where in between asking your child to go get something on another aisle, you give them one or two sentences. That's about the capacity that they have to listen to you. But learning to listen to them without judgment. And what that means without judgment is the anxiety, the fear, the frustration, the anger that you have in reaction to a child's behaviors, to their issues, to their problems, to their choices, has to be managed by you. Because the minute you get upset in those ways, you're not safe. And I know that's counterintuitive, because how could you not be frightened when you hear that your child's making dangerous choices? That's nearly impossible. So the answer to it is, it's okay to feel it. I'm not asking you not to feel angry or frustrated. I'm saying go take care of it somewhere else. Don't hand it to them. They're already overwhelmed with everything. So we have to learn to be in a place where we can listen without judgment. We have to be in a place where we own our own emotions, where when we get triggers, we have a place to management. That can be a therapist, that can be a support group, that can be a trusted friend or mentor, but somebody else. It's somebody else's job to take care of you. The last person on this planet to take care of you and your feelings is your child. And if the message is, don't do this or that, or dad and mom are upset or afraid, you're basically saying to them, you need to my happiness, my serenity is your responsibility. So be good so that I'm not upset. And they can't bear that burden. So learning to listen without judgment is a process. And it requires us to do our own work in that process. Another deeper level of listening is empathizing. I use this example. This I think is a pretty simple example. If you see your child or somebody struggling with peer pressure, I'm sure everybody has encountered this. Teenagers are especially susceptible because of their development to peer pressure. The instinct from most people is to give them a little lecture on self-worth. Right? If they don't love you, they're not your friends. If they can't support you, they're not your friends. It doesn't matter what someone else thinks about you. It only matters what you think of yourself. Those kinds of lectures. What I have found is telling your own story about peer pressure. Tell them how hard it is for you sometimes to be judged. Tell them how sometimes you want to fit in. And how sometimes you're embarrassed in your community or in the world when people see a certain part of you. And the most amazing thing happens in those. Number one, they feel safe. They're not the problem, the only one with the issue. That's number one. Number two, they'll start lecturing you about peer pressure. It actually, because you create this psychological vacuum with it, you don't give them the solved answer, right? They're used to that. Mom and dad know everything. Mom and dad don't have problems. They've figured it all out. But when you create this vacuum, this question, automatically the mind goes to the place where they begin to fill it in. They begin to think about peer pressure and what it means. So that's just an example of empathizing. And in my work, part of my work as a therapist and as a father is trying to find common ground no matter what the challenge is. I remember I was working with violent offenders early in my career, and the most terrifying thing happened to me my first night on the job. I thought to myself, well, I'll be good at this because I've never done what these guys have done, so I'm better than them, so this should be pretty easy. They'll be looking up at me. And the most terrifying thing happened to me in the first night is I related to them. I could not believe how some of the core issues were so similar to the ones that I struggled with in my own life, and that was terrifying. I wanted to be different from them, and I wasn't. So the work is to find the similarities. Finding differences is not a sign of mental health. Finding similarities is a sign of mental health. It's easy to find differences, but it takes work, creativity, and openness to find similarities. So empathy and empathizing is that tool, is that skill. When your child is sharing something, find a way to relate to it. Find a way to acknowledge it. And don't give them the solved, resolved version of it. Give them the one where you still might be struggling with it. Number 3 on the skill list is asking or stating the intention. I think this is, of my list, this is the most underutilized, simplest one, and most effective. In my marriage, when we use it, it goes great. When we don't, it doesn't. We used it today. And what it is this, is when somebody's sharing something with you, instead of assuming you know how to respond, say, what would you like from me? Do you want me to just hear this? Or are you looking for a story or advice or about how I've overcome that challenge? What do you need from me in this process? Or if you're the sender, and I think those of you who are married could probably relate to this, you can also say, I'd like to share something with you, and here's what I want from you. I just want to be heard. Or I do want, rarely are you going to actually say, I want solutions. That's not really what we're going to say to each other. We're going to just say, this is what I would like from you. Can you do that for me? So asking the intention if you're the listener, or stating the intention if you're the sender, I can't overstate how fundamentally important this is in relationships, to know how to respond to somebody in a connected way. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about that idea of connection, because all of this is about connection. In the 1970s, there was a popular research study where they introduced rats into cages. And in the cages, they had 2 water sources. They had plain water, and they had water that was either laced with cocaine or heroin. And in almost all of those experiments, all of the rats consumed the drug-laced water to death and overdosed. Somebody came along in British Columbia years later and looked at this study and said, but these are cages, right? People don't live in cages. And so he created what he called a rat park. And it was 300 times the size, and it had places for families, it had toys, it had places to raise children, baby children rats. I guess you don't call them children, baby rats. And they introduced the 2 water sources again. And almost none of them ever overdosed or ever used it. They actually shunned it. They actually found it, they avoided it. And it's hard to have that kind of study on human beings. Maybe rats are different than us, but we did have that kind of study. It's called the Vietnam War. 20% of the American soldiers, used heroin on a regular basis during Vietnam. And when they came home, they were followed by researchers, and it was found that 95% of them got off of heroin without any kind of intervention. And so what we begin to postulate with all of these studies and these research projects is that a core element of addiction is a lack of connection. And maybe that need for that drug, it's not just about the chemical hook that's in it. It is powerful, but it's also about that connection. The conclusion of these studies was that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And so if we can use these tools, if we can introduce these tools, if we can proliferate these tools so that we can provide better connection in our families with our loved ones, we become a part of the solution, a part of the antidote, if you will. It's so amazing when somebody walks into a 12-step meeting and they say, I did this, 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 and this in my addiction. And some old-timer says, sit down next to me, this is where you belong. That's the kind of connection. That's the kind of listening. That's the kind of non-judgment that is healing to us. That's the kind of grace that makes shame disappear. Avoiding imperatives. Imperatives are things like you have to, you need to, you must, you ought to, you should. Some of you might be familiar with those phrases and heard them come out of your own mouth, and it is a way to shut down communication with a child. And learning to talk about things without using imperatives is a way to open it up. I had a father that was clear. We made these lists of imperatives not to use. And he was trying to write a letter to his heroin-addicted son while he was in treatment. And he was talking to me on the phone, and we were going over the letter, and he couldn't finish the sentence because he couldn't find a way to connect to his son without telling his son what he should do. Until he finally found the words, which was, I'm afraid, I love you, and in my experience, this is driving us apart. And it became that simple. We think words like should and have to and must and ought to, we think those are powerful. We fight wars over those words. Right? Those are not the most powerful thing that you can say. The most powerful thing you can say is, this is what I feel and this is what I believe. I had a father walk up to me after a lecture one time and said, do you have any research studies on marijuana that you can give to me? And I said, yeah, but tell me why. And he said, because my 23-year-old son is smoking pot in the basement. And I said, why don't you just tell him that you're not okay with it? And he said, I can do that? He had such an absence of self that he didn't know that that was enough. He didn't know that what he felt was enough to take a stand. And so these words are sometimes ways that we try to artificially create that expertise, that this must happen. Number 5 is avoid polarizations, always, never. I think that's a pretty common communication tool. Our research shows us that families that are successful post-treatment 2 years identify eliminating polarizations as the number one thing, number one most common thing. And it's a strange thing, right? We're talking about drug addiction tonight, and I'm talking about not using things like always and never. But it becomes a way of thinking. You start to think about things in the gray area. Instead of saying we're back at square one or this is just like it was before, we say things like, this reminds me of the way it was. We have a dialogue around it where there's gray. You're not all good or all bad. There's a lot of gray in it. Avoiding advice. This kind of goes with the imperatives, but I make it my goal. I aspire to never give advice to clients. I might tell them in my experience, I might tell them I have a thought or an idea that may or may not work. And with my children, never give advice. I tell them this is what I was watching an interview with the musician David Bowie, who just died this year, the rock musician David Bowie, who died. And he was being asked about his recovery. And in about a 45-second clip, he said the phrase, for me, about 10 times. For me, drinking one drink will kill me. For me, I can't go there. This is what it's like for me. And he was very clear. And that's it. Imagine being talked to that way. For me, this is what it's like. I'm not telling you your truth. Because in adolescence and young adulthood, the threat of consumption by the other parent, by the one, is so threatening sometimes that they would rather run into a wall. They would run away from that. And so if we take over their identity and tell them the way that it needs to be, and that's coming from our thinking, by the way, and they don't have the same brain that we do, even when they're not an addict, but addicts don't think like us. And that's another thing I thought tonight. We're going to have to think differently. We're going to have to apply different kinds of thinking, a different way of thinking. The parents that I work with that love our program the most, they aren't always the ones with the best outcomes, but they're the ones who themselves were changed in the process, who developed those new eyes and those new ears. And so their relationship to the problem changed. So avoiding advice, telling somebody the way it is important. I talked about owning your feelings. I want to tell this quick story about a young woman. I was sitting in a group in the wilderness. I run a wilderness therapy program. So we take these people out to the desert and to the mountains for a couple of months, and we do therapy, and we hike around. Sound familiar? And I was sitting in a group, and this young woman, it was her turn to read the first letter that she got from her parents and grandmother, where they were concerned about it. It was a letter of love, and it was a letter of concern, and a letter of what they hoped for her for the program. And it was a tremendously painful set of letters. There was drug abuse and prostitution. There was stealing and lying. There was violence. And she's reading this letter, and tears are running down her face, snot's running down her face. And after she finished her third letter, and she sat there for a few moments crying, whimpering and crying, one of the other girls in the group gently, after a moment, said, "What are you feeling?" And she said, "I feel so bad that I let my parents down." And I said, "I think that's the least important part of that letter. I think the most important part of that letter is that you were almost dying, and you were hurting people, and you were hurting yourself. You were letting yourself down in the process." And that initial guilt of "I let my parents down" will only last until the next time she's really, really angry with them. And so that's not going to be the long-term fuel. Sometimes that can start the engine, but it will not be the long-term fuel for recovery, for change. So learning to own your feelings. This is my frustration. I'm frustrated. I'm angry. I'm sad. Even in my work, I tell parents not to tell the children that they make them happy. You know that old adage, you're only as happy as your least happy child? It's crazy. It's not okay. It seems nice. It seems loving. But that means, again, that they are wearing the burden of your happiness. And I have 4 children, and I love them in a way that I never knew I could love human beings. So I understand that connection. But I also want to make, and I want to invite all of us to make our serenity, as they say in Al-Anon, our responsibility. So owning your emotions is a part of this process. One of my favorite quotes from a book, it's actually quoting Gandhi, says, a coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is the prerogative of the brave. Projection, fusion, going home is easy. Loving another's otherness is heroic. If we really love the other as other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility for our own individuation, our own journey, and this heroism may be properly called love. You know, I think if we went around, everybody would talk about the love that they have for their children and for their family. But if we look at love as a verb, it requires us to do courageous things. In my program, in wilderness therapy, we use the wilderness literally and metaphorically. The wilderness in story is often a place that you go to search for something. And the thing that occurs in that journey is that sometimes you don't always find what you're looking for. King Arthur's knights, for example, didn't find the Holy Grail. But what they found was a story. And they brought that story back to the community, and they shared it. So we invite those in recovery to go and sit in rooms with other people. We invite you into rooms. We invite you into this room. We invite you into Al-Anon, to Codependence Anonymous, to AA, to therapy sessions. Those terrifying places that you go where you think you're going in there to save somebody else. But what ends up happening is you save yourself in the process. The best thing that we can do to contribute to this problem is to do those courageous things. And the best thing that we can do to help our children find themselves is to find them. And to find them means that we first find ourselves, that we go inside. I think it was Lewis says that we have to go inside of ourselves. When I know this, when I know who I am, then I know that everything that is not me is something else, somebody else. If I don't know where this line is, if it has gaps in it or it's fuzzy, I don't know whether I'm parenting you or I'm parenting my own childhood. I'm trying to make up for something that I didn't get. Or I'm asking you to do something for me that was my parents' responsibility, which is to love me unconditionally. That was their job, or as close as they could get to it. It's not your job as my child. And if it didn't happen adequately in my past, I'm not going to require it of you. Because parenting isn't about the love that comes up at us. It's about the love that we send at them. My mother said it so beautifully when she told me, you will never love your parents as much as you love your children. And it was so liberating to hear that from my mother. I was so glad. Because I thought that was true. I thought something was wrong with me, but you're right. So My book, my work is an invitation. It's not the answer. It's not the solution. It's an invitation into a different way of thinking, a different sensibility. And while there are some skills and some tools, it's really learning how to think differently. And some of that has been talked about tonight. My book is called The Journey of the Heroic Parent, and it borrows on Joseph Campbell's idea where he studied mythology and storytelling. And he talked about this pattern that he called the hero's journey. He wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It was actually, for those of you who know of the movie Star Wars, it was what George Lucas based Star Wars on. That's the hero's journey. And he said that when the hero is initially called to this quest, whatever it is, they often refuse it. They're reluctant. Sometimes they have to get shoved into it. Sometimes we don't answer the call until something like a crisis happens. And sometimes it can be a whisper, and that's up to you. The question, what does the hero really discover at the end of the journey? And the epic story of Gilgamesh, which speaks to every parent's journey, Gilgamesh becomes distressed at the death of his friend Enkidu. Due to his suffering, Gilgamesh leaves his home and undertakes the long and perilous journey, searching for the secret of eternal life. He endures many trials and tribulations on his quest. He swims to the bottom of the sea and retrieves the plant of immortality. When he resurfaces, he sets it down on the ground, and while he bathes, the serpent steals it, and the sacred plant of immortality is lost. So what does the hero find? On his journey, he finds the elixir of healing wisdom, something that he can share with others. We experience deep pain and develop compassion as we face the depths of our own struggles honestly. And what we find is our story. We sit in groups, tell our stories, and listen to the stories of others. The hero brings back herself, a deeper, richer version of herself. Loving your child is something you cannot not do. You will break and bleed. Old things will die in you, and in their stead, new things will grow. And what you will have in the end is your story. For me, even as a teacher, the elixir isn't always in the form of words. Some of what I've gleaned on my journey is something that you can't put into words because it's an experience rather than an explanation. You learn something by going through it that you cannot learn any other way. My education and study have given me language, but being present on my painful and beautiful journey has carved out a place for more compassion toward others and toward myself. I'm honored to share with you today some of the observations from the thousands of heroes' journeys that I've witnessed, from children and parents. This is my story, this is my gift, and this is also the gift that these remarkable and wonderful people have given to me, and I give it back to you. Thank you.